Tonight, David suffers the intense loneliness as he loses his job and is separated from his family. That's the key. He not only loses that source of security and comfort and income, but he is separated from his heritage, his whole purpose for existence, having that family that he passed on to, his name. And he's separated from them. And basically he finds this. He suffers the loneliness that we also would face if we're away from work and home and family. And he records that in Psalm 52. He goes on to, because of this, in Psalm 56, he goes, and we won't, I don't know how deep we'll get into this tonight, but he has to move to a new location that's foreign to him. And he goes through that. He writes 2 Psalms about that. Then he lives and works with that tough crowd. He lost one job, gets another one. He becomes a babysitter for 400 delinquents, basically, is what is in that cave with him. And he writes the most out of that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different Psalms from those cave times. And then he's unsettled at home. His wife gives him a hard time. And then he's betrayed by his friends, as I mentioned this morning. He goes through all of these 12 areas that I mentioned. And in each one of them, he leaves a beautiful record. Well, David lost his job. And I want you to think about that as you look at the beginning of Psalm 52, the superscription. Remember I told you about that? Look at that. It should say in your Bible in Psalm 52, these little words should be there. To the chief musician, a contemplation of David when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. Now that in Psalm 52 just doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, you just read that and you would just go home and singing praises right after you read that. Well, let's look at what it means. Keep your finger here and go back to 1 Samuel 21. And I want to give you an example of what you should do. Don't be a comfortable, well-adjusted reader. 1 Samuel 21 is what I want you to see with me, okay? In America, if we're a comfortable, well-adjusted reader, if we read something like Doeg the Edomite, we just keep going. We don't stop to say, Doeg the who? Doeg the Edomite? Edom? This is Israel. Doeg? Who's he? Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Why on earth would that be at the front of that psalm? We don't think about that. Now maybe if we have a good study Bible, there's a little note down there. But if we're in a hurry and have just a little bit of time to read our Bible, we don't even take the time to read the footnote. So I'd like to encourage you, as I did this morning, encouraging you to realize that the Psalms come from the life experiences of David. They're not just hanging out there in the vacuum. They aren't just 1 through 150, and they aren't just out there just floating. They're all tied to events. Some of them are tied to festivals. Some of them are tied to coming up to the feast days. Some of them are tied to the lengthening of the life of Hezekiah. I mean, there's so many. Moses wrote 2 of them. Solomon wrote a bunch. There are all kinds of, some of them flow out of the worship director of the temple and all that was going on there. But 73 of them flow out of David's life. And 31 of those are specifically tagged like this. Look at 1 Samuel 21. And I want to show you this. Now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Why did he come there? Well, back up in chapter 20. Look at verse 33. This is David's pink slip. As I said, this is him losing his job. Look at 1 Samuel 20 and verse 33. Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him. I mean, if you get killed, you lost your job, right? Well, he didn't make it. He didn't kill him. So David left. He left his work. And verse 1 says that he's going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. And you know the story that he goes through, and he gives him the consecrated bread and gets his old sword. And I just can't go by this. David getting the verse 9. Look at 21:9. Nob, by the way, for those of you that didn't take the time when you were reading the Bible through this year and you got to here and you looked on a map, you know, when you read a place, you ought to see if it's on the map. That'll teach them. You know, Nob is just outside of Jerusalem. If you're up on the Mount of Olives, on the east side of Jerusalem, go up to the top of the Mount of Olives, the very top. When you get to the top, you can look over and you can see the Dead Sea. And if you look just to the left, Dead Sea is over this way. If you look just to the left, kind of northeast, just outside Jerusalem, there's a little area, just a ruin, and that's the priestly city of Nob. Just just outside the city. It's just very close. Of course, it wasn't built up back then, so it was quite a hike for David. But look what verse 9 says is in Nob. It says, the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you'll take that, take it, for there's no other except that one. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. Now for just a second, I'm going to emphasize this all the way through, and I'm going to, in just a moment, give you a chronicle. I want you to realize something about David. David never changed from his youth. David decided way back in Psalm 19 and Psalm 23 and Psalm 132 also, he decided when he was a little boy that in everything in life he was going to turn to God with it. He didn't leave God out of any part of his life. He didn't leave God out of his youth. He didn't leave God out of his adulthood, and he didn't leave God out of his old age. He made it a habit. He just said, God is who I'm going to share everything with. And so when David, in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 54, killed Goliath and got the trophy, which was Goliath's sword, and there was no sword like it, because the people that were the experts in iron were the Philistines. They were the ones that knew metallurgy. They were actually Minoans. They were from Greece. They were highly trained people that invaded Israel and lived along the coast. They were, you think of Alexander and all the greatness of Greece, these were the predecessors to that. They made the greatest sword for Goliath, and David killed him and got that sword as a trophy. Now let me ask you, how did it get in verse 9 into the tent of God? Because David, listen, from his youth, always gave his trophies to God. Isn't that interesting? David gave his trophies to God. He said, God, I didn't defeat Goliath. You did. I don't get the credit for this. You do. The sword's like none other. I'm leaving it here in Nob in the tent of God. I'm going to give my trophies to you because I want you to get all the credit for my life. How can you go wrong with an attitude like that? And what I just share with you is what we always sit there. Everybody's been in the Holy Land has seen my little Nob story. I take them up the top and we turn and we look over there and we do just what we just did, because that is one of the greatest lessons in the Bible about how we should live our lives. Give your trophies to God. Give the credit to Him. Give the glory to Him for anything you accomplish in life. And there's no limit to what the Lord can do with and in and through you. So David gets that sword, and then you know the story. He goes on his way, and what happens though is that there's this little weaselly guy named Doeg who was there. And he runs back and tells Saul about this, and David has to run on. So that's the background. Now quickly go back to Psalm 52, and I want to go through it with you, because if you would like to write in your Bible, I have written right in the top, right where the printers have put Psalm 52, and then they have this little end of the wicked and peace of the godly, their kind of little comment on it. Right around all that stuff, I have written, David lost his job. And then I wrote 1 Samuel 21, 1-9. So I would know the event. And I love to go back and read all that surrounding stuff before I read the psalm, because as soon as you do that, all of a sudden you can see this psalm through the eyes of how God looked on it. See, God saw the big picture, and God inspired David to write this psalm not in a vacuum, but in the context of this job loss. This incredible notice from his employer when he whips a spear at him, and David has to run for his life and leaves everything important behind to him. Well, David suffers intense loneliness as he loses his job. And Psalm 52 is the record and his testimony of how to overcome the feelings of loneliness when we're out of work, when our whole life gets turned upside down, and everything that we counted on, all the regularity, all of the patterns that work establishes, and all the familiarity just is gone. And we just find ourselves just kind of like going, we don't know what to do, we don't know what's next. David lost his job. David fled from his home because of the dangers facing him. I showed you that in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 33. But in fleeing, he also leaves behind his job. And listen, David had been continuously employed since his earliest youth. You know that if you've read the Bible. You know that he had been constantly working since he was a boy. David had always had a job. That is often who is hit the hardest by job loss, those who have never felt the sting of loss. David never had time to think about unemployment because he tended the sheep. Remember that he was the youngest, and as the youngest child, it fell to him. The older boys, they didn't want to watch those smelly, dumb sheep, as they referred to them. The little flock, as they talk about in 1 Samuel 16 and 17 and 18, that little flock. So it was pushed off on David as the eighth, the youngest of the boys. He attended the sheep. Then later on, he worked as a courier for his dad during the war. Remember the big Philistine war in chapter 17? David was a courier. He would run provisions to the front lines to his brothers who were in the battle. And then he'd come home to dad, check on the sheep, run provisions to his brothers. And so he went from being shepherd to being a courier for his dad, taking those provisions to the army. Then after defeating Goliath in chapter 17, he was hired by the government. He got a government job. King Saul hired him to work for him. He worked in the various departments of the government. He worked in the entertainment department. Do you remember that? He played the harp for the king. I mean, he had quite a job. He worked in the military. He was sent out to raid and kill the enemy Philistines. Finally, he became a member of the cabinet. See, he's moved up in his job. Never out of a job. He just was moving right up. And now he's in the cabinet. He sat at the table with the king, with the other advisors and the other chiefs of Saul's kingdom. And he sat there, and he would advise him as his son-in-law on security and military issues. He led a squad of warriors for the king. In fact, to earn his wife, the king says, I want you to kill 100 Philistines, and he kills 200. I mean, he was an eager beaver. I mean, he's one of these guys, they say, here's your quota for your territory, and he exceeds it. He was quite a worker. So David lost his job. He'd always had a job. But David, when he lost his job, was up to his neck in work when it happened. David lived by the king. He worked for the king. He was married to the king's daughter. He ate with the king. He served the king with music. He found all of his financial and family security in that job. And then everything changed. Isn't that what always happens? It hits us hardest because everything is just rolling. We're up to our neck. It's just unbelievable, the workload, and then, boom, everything changed. And David loses that job by a clear notice from his employer. Saul throws a spear at him and tries to kill him. That was the pink slip of 3,000 years ago. It was more direct and blunt back then. Nowadays, they say we're having a staff reduction, or I don't know all the words they use, reassignment. But this was a big surprise to David, to his best friend Jonathan, I'm sure to his wife and family, but it was no surprise to God. When you and I and those we love and know go through these big disasters of life, it's a surprise to us. It's a surprise to our loved ones, but it's no surprise to God. And that's the lesson David's going to learn here. This was a big surprise to everyone but God. He was so recently unemployed for the first time in his life that David looks around at his situation and finds the pain that always surrounds such a sudden and unexpected change in everything he had relied upon. But everything had changed in his life except what was most important.